At our Thanksgiving party, the room was warm with candlelight and fake laughter until my grandfather Charles suddenly stood up. He tapped his crystal glass, commanding the room's attention, and shouted, "Why is an elderly couple living in the $2.5 million coastal estate I bought for you?" Forks froze midair. Nicholas's smile cracked completely. I could not even breathe because I had no idea what he was talking about. I stared at him and whispered the only truth I had left in my life. "What are you talking about? I am homeless right now, the kind of homeless you do not post about." Across the table, Samantha went paper white, looking like she had just been caught in a trap she could not outrun. And then the heavy oak front door opened. A woman in a sharp suit walked in carrying a thick briefcase. Our family dinner was not a dinner anymore, it was a courtroom, and I was the primary exhibit. But before I reveal how I lost everything while my own family lived in absolute luxury, drop a simple hi in the comments, or tell me where you are watching from. Sometimes knowing one real person is listening is the only thing that keeps you steady. And if you have ever been the one blamed, ignored, or quietly crushed behind closed doors, please subscribe so you do not miss what happens next, because the truth is ugly, and I am done carrying it alone. Thank you. And now, let me tell you everything. To understand the chaos of that dining room, we have to rewind a few days. The biting wind of late November was howling through the gaps of my rusted van parked under a concrete highway overpass. I am a licensed architect. I spent years studying how to design warm, sustainable, and beautiful spaces for a living. Yet here I was shivering under a thin, moth-eaten blanket. Beside me was Buster. He is an old golden retriever, his muzzle completely white now. He has been by my side since I was a lonely child. Buster pushed his cold nose against my cracked palm, offering the only pure comfort I had left in the world. I held a plastic bottle of cheap joint supplements in my other hand. I had counted out 85 quarters at a gas station counter just to buy them for him. I would gladly skip my own meals rather than let Buster suffer in the damp cold. He whimpered softly, a low sound that broke my heart, and I wrapped my arms around his large frame to share whatever body heat I had left. How does a top-tier architecture graduate end up brushing her teeth in public transit restrooms? It does not happen overnight. It is a slow, methodical fade. It leaks out piece by piece, rejection by rejection. I watched the headlights of the traffic rushing above us, feeling the heavy vibrations of cars carrying people back to warm, safe homes. I used to think that hard work was an impenetrable shield. I firmly believed that if I just kept my head down, designed flawless blueprints, and pushed through the sheer exhaustion, I would eventually earn my rightful place. I was tragically wrong. The people who were supposed to protect me were the exact same people dismantling my life brick by brick. Every single time I tried to build a solid foundation, they quietly removed the support beams. Buster shifted his weight, resting his heavy, tired head heavily on my knee. He is the absolute only family I have left. He is the only soul who has never asked me to shrink myself down just to make room for his ego. As the midnight temperature dropped further, I closed my eyes and whispered a promise to him that we would survive this winter. I just did not know how. The brutal truth is, I was drowning. I was suffocating in a narrative I did not write, authored by people who saw my existence as nothing more than a tool. The cold kept me awake. To understand my absolute ruin, you have to deeply understand the architects who designed it, Nicholas and Everly. I stopped calling them Dad and Mom a very long time ago. They are absolute masters of a very specific toxic art form. They practice professional victimhood neatly wrapped in an upper-middle-class aesthetic. On their social media profiles, they are glowing pillars of the community. They post highly edited photos from charity galas and exclusive ski resorts. But behind their heavy mahogany doors, they operate a psychological debt collection agency. And their primary lifelong debtor was always me. Then there is Samantha, my older sister, the undeniable golden child of the house. Samantha never had to work a single difficult day for anything. She is a lifestyle influencer whose entire online brand is built on effortless, unearned luxury. Her daily feed is an endless parade of designer handbags, expensive brunches, and exotic vacations. But that effortless luxury was heavily subsidized by my silent exhaustion. While she was posing for cameras in Aspen, I was being relentlessly guilt-tripped into taking out massive credit cards in my own name. The justification was always to cover sudden, mysterious, emergency family expenses. Nicholas would sit me down at the kitchen island, his face a carefully constructed mask of weary sacrifice. He would talk for hours about how incredibly hard he worked to feed me when I was just a child. He would itemize every single dollar he ever spent on my basic education. Everly would invariably chime in dramatically, dabbing her perfectly dry eyes with a tissue. She would preach that families must always support each other through dark financial times. They made me feel like an overgrown, ungrateful burden. I was systematically convinced that my very existence was a luxury they could barely afford. So, I signed the banking papers. I took on the crushing debt. I transferred my meager architectural internship earnings directly into joint accounts that Samantha ultimately drained for her lifestyle. I genuinely thought I was being a dutiful, loving daughter. I thought I was simply paying back a moral mortgage that came inherently with my birth. They isolated me so thoroughly that I believed their distorted reality was the only reality. Whenever I politely questioned the chaotic math, I was immediately labeled selfish. I was called deeply ungrateful. They used my natural empathy as a weapon to disarm me. I shrank my own life to fit into the tiny, suffocating box they built for me. I allowed them to siphon my resources, my creative energy, and my entire self-worth. They built a towering, glittering facade of success, and they used my bones as the invisible scaffolding to hold it up. I was paying for nothing. The absolute breaking point did not start with a loud, dramatic shout. It started with the quiet rustle of official paper. Exactly 1 week before the infamous Thanksgiving dinner, Everly demanded I clean out the damp, dusty garage. Samantha needed extra storage space for her overflowing promotional packages. I was already bone-tired from working 3 different freelance design gigs under a fake online name just to buy food for Buster, but I obeyed. I always obeyed without question. That is the invisible heavy chain of a lifelong survivor. When you are deeply conditioned from early childhood to believe you are an eternal burden, compliance simply becomes a survival reflex. Psychologists call it learned helplessness. You eventually stop trying to escape the heavy iron cage because you truly believe the bars are inside your own mind. You systematically convince yourself that the daily pain is just normal weather. That is exactly how they keep you trapped without ever needing to lock a single door. While moving a heavy stack of moldy cardboard boxes, a thick sealed envelope slipped out and hit the concrete floor. It was an official property tax notice from the state. The property address listed was a massive coastal estate in Monterey, a multi-million-dollar property, and the registered owner listed clearly at the very top was me, Verisa. I stared at the crisp paper, my heart pounding violently against my ribs. I did not own a coastal estate. I was currently struggling to pay for basic unleaded gas, but there, at the bottom of a transferred deed document tucked behind the tax notice, was my signature, except it was not my handwriting. The ink loops were entirely wrong. The slant was far too sharp. It was a blatant, incredibly sloppy forgery. Someone had transferred a massive, valuable property into my name, or completely out of it, and deliberately forged my legal consent. My very first instinct was not fiery rage, it was pure, paralyzing terror. I wanted to march straight into the living room and demand absolute answers from Nicholas and Everly, but the invisible chain pulled tight, choking my throat. If I confronted them, they would expertly turn it around on me. They would say I was maliciously snooping. They would call me mentally unstable. They would threaten to kick Buster out into the freezing street. The deeply ingrained psychological conditioning of 20 long years immediately kicked in. I carefully folded the heavy paper and slipped it deep into my pocket. I went right back to sweeping the dusty garage floor, my hands shaking violently. Why would I own a mansion in Monterey? I felt completely sick to my stomach. I was holding physical proof of a massive financial crime, yet I was the one feeling incredibly guilty. That is the ultimate brilliant trap of toxic family abuse. They train you to police your own thoughts. The paper burned my skin. To truly understand exactly why I stayed completely silent with that forged legal document burning in my pocket, you have to look further back. You have to see exactly how the invisible iron cage was built around me. It was a cold Tuesday evening during my junior year of college. I had just received a formal letter confirming my acceptance into a highly prestigious advanced architecture workshop. It was a massive game changer for my future career. I rushed home, completely out of breath and glowing with rare pride. I just needed a very small loan to purchase the required drafting software. It was not a luxury item, it was an absolute academic necessity. I stood in the center of the kitchen and showed the official letter to Everly. I hesitated for a moment, then quietly asked for the money. The hostile reaction was instantaneous. Everly did not smile. She did not offer a single word of congratulations. She aggressively dropped her wet dishcloth, grabbed the sharp edge of the counter, and her eyes filled with immediate weaponized tears. "You want to absolutely kill this family, do you not, Verisa?" She sobbed, her voice trembling with highly practiced agony. She violently snatched the acceptance letter from my hands and crumpled it into a tight fist. "Do you have any idea what I sacrifice for you every single day I eat expired clearance food? I scrub these hardwood floors until my back breaks just so you have a roof over your head. And now you dare to demand these ridiculous, selfish luxuries." I froze completely. The bright joy drained rapidly out of me, replaced by a suffocating, familiar wave of heavy guilt. I desperately tried to explain that the software was strictly for my education, that it would help me secure a good job later. But logic has absolutely no place in a house strictly ruled by emotional manipulation. Just then, Samantha stomped heavily down the stairs. She was furious about a petty argument with her latest boyfriend, her face twisted in a vicious, ugly scowl. She saw me standing there looking helpless and instantly found her perfect target. Samantha marched directly over to the dining table where my fragile architectural models and weeks of meticulous hand-drawn blueprints were resting. Without a single word of warning, she violently swept her arm across the entire table. My delicate models crashed to the hardwood floor, shattering into dozens of unfixable pieces. My blueprints scattered everywhere like dead autumn leaves. "It is just a useless freeloader," Samantha screamed, her voice shrill and echoing painfully off the walls. She pointed a sharp, manicured finger directly at my chest. "You and your stupid, filthy animal are nothing but a massive burden on us." I dropped heavily to my knees, frantically trying to gather my ruined work. The cage locked around me. Samantha's rage was absolutely blinding that evening. She raised her heavy designer leather boot, aiming directly for the largest, most fragile architectural model resting near my trembling knees. I braced myself for the sharp impact, squeezing my eyes tightly shut, completely paralyzed by the heavy guilt my mother had just dumped on my shoulders. But the devastating blow never reached me. A blur of golden fur darted desperately across the kitchen floor. There was a dull, heavy thud. It was a sickening, hollow sound that I will never ever forget as long as I live. Buster had lunged forward without a single second of hesitation, placing his own fragile, aging body perfectly between my sister's angry boot and my cowering frame. He let out a sharp, breathless yelp that completely shattered my heart. He immediately tucked his tail between his legs, retreating slowly and painfully into the darkest corner of the kitchen. Despite the obvious pain, his soft brown eyes remained locked entirely on me, silently making sure his owner was safe. I scrambled frantically across the cold floor, crawling over to him and burying my face deeply into his thick golden fur, my silent tears soaking his coat. I could feel his rapid heartbeat against my palms. Just then, Nicholas walked into the room, drawn by the sudden commotion. He did not ask what had happened. He did not reprimand his precious golden child for her unhinged outburst. Instead, he looked down at me and the shivering dog with absolute freezing contempt. "Take your filthy animal out to the freezing garage immediately," he ordered, his voice dangerously low, flat, and completely devoid of any paternal warmth. "Do not let me see either of your pathetic faces inside this house until you learn how to earn real money and properly pay back the massive debt of your upbringing." I did not argue. I gathered my dog and walked out into the biting cold of the attached garage. That was the exact night I realized a profound, undeniable truth. Buster was not just a pet I had rescued years ago. He was my only genuine family member. He was the only living being in that massive hollow house who truly loved me unconditionally. He willingly took the physical and emotional blows meant for me without a single complaint or expectation of repayment. The people inside the warm house were monsters. He was my only shield. The garage was freezing, smelling faintly of old motor oil and damp cardboard, but it was safely away from their constant glaring eyes. I sat on a thin, uncomfortable cot, wrapping Buster tightly in my only winter coat to share my body heat. From the secret inner pocket of my worn backpack, I pulled out a small, heavily creased photograph. It was a faded, damaged image of an older man with sharp, intelligent eyes and a stern, unapologetic jawline. It was my grandfather, Charles. Ever since I was a little girl, Nicholas had painted a vivid, monstrous picture of him to anyone who would listen. The official family narrative was that Charles was a deeply selfish, treacherous man who callously abandoned his only son to chase massive, greedy wealth in Europe. Nicholas absolutely loved to play the tragic, heroic victim. He constantly claimed at every social gathering that he had to pull himself up from absolute grinding poverty because his own father cruelly refused to help him. He built his entire persona on this foundational myth of abandonment. But as I stared closely at the photograph in the dim, flickering garage light, something never quite added up. The man in the picture simply did not look like a careless coward. He looked incredibly grounded, highly observant, and fiercely resilient. Whenever Nicholas told his dramatic stories of childhood abandonment, his eyes would nervously dart away, and his voice would take on a defensive, highly unnatural pitch. It was the exact same deceptive tone he used when he was blatantly lying to his wealthy friends about Samantha's completely fictional career achievements. I carefully hid the photo back inside my bag, making sure it was completely out of sight. I had a strange, quiet intuition growing in my chest. I began to strongly suspect that the monstrous ghost of my grandfather was actually a highly convenient fictional character, specifically designed to hide a much darker, much more pathetic truth about my own parents. They needed an external villain to justify their own endless internal failures. I did not know the truth yet, but I knew I could not trust the storytellers. The truth was always hidden. Despite the relentless psychological warfare waged within those walls, I managed to graduate at the absolute top of my university class. I had a stunning, innovative portfolio and glowing recommendations from highly esteemed professors. I started applying to the most prestigious architectural firms in the city, feeling a tiny, desperate spark of genuine hope. I made it to the final rigorous interview rounds for 3 different highly coveted positions. The hiring managers smiled warmly, praised my creative designs, and promised to send official offers within the week. But the offers never arrived. Instead, I received cold, generic, and suspiciously vague rejection emails. It made absolutely no logical sense. The crushing turning point came late one night when Nicholas carelessly left his primary laptop open and logged in on the kitchen island. I only needed to quickly check a delayed email from a recruiter, but what I found in his sent folder completely shattered my reality. There were dozens of anonymous messages sent directly to the exact HR departments I had just interviewed with. The emails falsely claimed to be from former classmates and previous landlords. They viciously accused me of severe mental instability, claiming I suffered from violent schizophrenic episodes and habitually stole creative ideas from other students. I stood frozen in the dark kitchen, staring blankly at the glowing screen. The IP address matched our home router perfectly. The harsh, aggressive writing style and the specific vocabulary choices were undeniably Nicholas's signature tone. My own father had meticulously, systematically destroyed my professional reputation before it even started. He did this just to ensure I could never achieve true financial independence. He knew that if I got a high-paying job, I would immediately move out and escape their control. He needed me broken. He needed me constantly begging for their scraps. I carefully took out my phone and quietly took clear, high-resolution photos of every single email, capturing the timestamps and the recipient addresses. I did not confront him. I simply closed the laptop exactly as I found it. I was sleeping near my enemy. With my architectural career effectively sabotaged and my confidence in ruins, I was entirely trapped in their expanding financial web. Because I could not secure a firm job, Everly immediately switched her manipulative tactics. She loudly claimed the household was facing catastrophic, immediate debt due to a bad investment. She sobbed violently at the kitchen table, begging me to apply for high-limit credit cards in my own pristine name to help keep the family afloat during this temporary crisis. I was heavily conditioned to obey her tears, so I numbly signed the digital applications. The glossy plastic cards arrived in the mail, and they immediately vanished directly into Everly's designer purse. The so-called emergency family expenses were an absolute fabricated lie. The massive credit lines were rapidly drained to completely fund Samantha's lavish, extremely photogenic lifestyle. My pristine credit paid for her luxury ski trips, her high-end cosmetic procedures, and her premium gym memberships. Meanwhile, my personal credit score plummeted off a steep, terrifying cliff. When the cards were inevitably maxed out and completely locked by the furious banks, their attitude shifted from desperate tears to outright visceral disgust. They openly called me a useless freeloader in front of guests. I was eating cheap instant noodles in the dark and skipping meals entirely just to make the minimum monthly interest payments, while Samantha posted bright photos of $100 steaks online. They had successfully turned me into a human ATM, a financial sponge to absorb their greed. And they were absolutely furious that the machine was finally out of cash. Whenever I politely asked where the money had actually gone, Nicholas would slam his fist on the table and remind me of the immense cost of raising me. They weaponized my sense of duty, turning my own empathy into a financial prison. I was completely drowning in a sea of debt that did not belong to me, chained to a family that saw me only as a consumable resource. They bled my future completely dry. The absolute breaking point finally arrived on a bitterly cold evening, just a few short weeks before Thanksgiving. Samantha had abruptly decided her online image desperately required a brand new imported sports car. Because her own credit was notoriously terrible from years of unpaid bills, she desperately needed a clean cosigner with no prior auto loans. Nicholas confidently slammed the thick dealership paperwork onto the dining table, thrusting a pen toward my chest and demanding my signature. I slowly looked down at the astronomical monthly payments printed on the crisp white paper. I looked at the smug, entitled smirk on Samantha's face. And then, for the very first time in my entire life, I looked Nicholas directly in the eye, kept my voice perfectly steady, and quietly said, "No." The room went completely, terrifyingly silent. Nicholas's face turned a violent, dangerous shade of purple. The carefully maintained facade of the weary, sacrificing father vanished instantly, replaced by a vicious, unhinged tyrant whose control was slipping. "You ungrateful, selfish wretch," he screamed, his booming voice shaking the expensive crystal chandeliers above us. He forcefully grabbed my only winter coat from the hallway rack and threw it violently out the front door into the freezing, accumulating snow. "Get out of my house immediately. If you will not contribute to this family's success, you do not deserve to live under my roof." He did not even let me grab my remaining clothes or my drafting tools. I scrambled out the door, calling desperately for Buster to follow me. The heavy oak door slammed shut with a deafening crash behind us, the heavy metal deadbolt clicking loudly into place. We were completely alone in the freezing, unforgiving dark. I guided my shivering dog toward my old battered van parked quietly down the street. The engine barely turned over, coughing against the cold. I was officially homeless, stripped of everything, but as I hugged Buster, I felt something incredibly strange. I finally recognized my true freedom. Surviving in the van was a brutal, relentless test of daily endurance. The sharp, icy wind of the deep winter seemed to slice directly through the thin, rusted metal walls of my old vehicle. Every single morning, I woke up with my breath completely frozen on the inside of the windows. But as I looked down at Buster, who was curled up peacefully under my heavy winter coat, I did not feel the crushing despair that Nicholas and Everly desperately wanted me to feel. I felt an incredibly strange, quiet sense of absolute clarity. I was no longer living under their opulent roof, which meant I was no longer a captive audience to their daily psychological warfare. For the very first time in my 30 years of life, my mind was entirely my own. I knew that finding a traditional job at an established architectural firm was currently impossible. Nicholas had ensured that my professional reputation was completely radioactive with his vicious, anonymous emails, so I systematically adapted to the harsh new reality. I drove my van to the back parking lot of a local public library every single morning right as the sun came up. I sat in the deepest corner of the reference section, utilizing their free internet connection to quietly rebuild my entire professional portfolio. I meticulously removed my real name, Verisa, from every single digital file and blueprint. I created a completely new, untraceable online pseudonym to offer freelance drafting and design services to overseas clients who did not care about local industry gossip. The first few weeks were an agonizing exercise in extreme patience. I lived entirely on cheap canned beans and stale bread, ensuring that Buster always ate before I did. But slowly, the freelance contracts began to steadily trickle in. My architectural designs spoke for themselves. They were precise, innovative, and delivered well ahead of tight deadlines. I vividly remember the exact moment my very first international payment cleared into a newly opened deeply hidden bank account. I sat in the driver's seat of my freezing van, staring at the bright notification on my cracked phone screen. It was not a massive fortune, but it was clean, honest money. It was the first currency in my entire life that did not carry the suffocating heavy tax of my mother's weaponized tears. I immediately drove to the nearest premium pet store. I did not buy myself a hot meal. Instead, I walked straight to the veterinary aisle and purchased the most expensive, highly effective joint supplements they carried for Buster. As I fed him the medicine that night in the quiet, dark parking lot, I softly stroked his golden head. We were physically homeless, but we were fundamentally untouchable. I was slowly gathering the invisible bricks I needed to construct an impenetrable fortress. I was learning how to survive in the absolute dark. I started building my fortress. While my freelance design business slowly but steadily began to flourish in the absolute shadows, I initiated the second phase of my silent retaliation. I was making enough money to easily rent a small, warm apartment, but I deliberately chose to stay in the van a little while longer to aggressively save every single penny. I needed an undeniable, robust war chest. More importantly, I needed an absolute airtight arsenal of indisputable facts. The painful memory of the forged property tax document I had found in the garage constantly burned in the back of my mind. It was a massive, highly dangerous loose end that I absolutely could not ignore. I purchased a military-grade encrypted external hard drive using cash. Every single night after finishing my client blueprints, I meticulously compiled the digital evidence of my family's extensive financial abuse. I started by formally requesting years of detailed historical statements from the credit card companies. I organized the data into precise spreadsheets cleanly, highlighting the massive withdrawals that directly funded Samantha's luxury vacations, expensive cosmetic procedures, and high-end restaurant dinners. I cross-referenced these specific dates with her highly curated social media posts, creating an undeniable, chronologically perfect map of their blatant theft. Next, I tackled the anonymous emails that had completely derailed my corporate career. I used my advanced technical skills to deeply analyze the routing data and digital footprints of those vicious messages. I securely archived the exact IP addresses, the specific timestamps, and the distinct, aggressive vocabulary patterns that unmistakably belonged to Nicholas. I treated this evidence gathering exactly like I treated a complex architectural project. I ensured the structural integrity of every single document was absolutely flawless. I knew that when the final confrontation inevitably arrived, my parents would attempt to rely on their usual theatrics. They would cry, they would scream, and they would desperately play the victim. I was preparing to fight a very different kind of war, a war where raw emotion was completely irrelevant and only cold, hard data survived. I did not boast about my growing savings. I did not post motivational quotes online about overcoming immense adversity. I remained entirely invisible, a ghost hovering just outside the perimeter of their glittering, fraudulent lives. I checked my hidden bank balance one snowy evening and realized I finally had enough capital to hire a premium legal team if necessary, but I was not ready to strike just yet. I needed to know exactly what they were planning with that mysterious property in Monterey. I needed them to feel completely, arrogantly safe before I systematically dismantled their entire world. I waited in the silence. The perfect opportunity to infiltrate their secure fortress arrived in the form of a highly manipulative text message from Everly just 3 days before Thanksgiving. My phone vibrated intensely on the van's dashboard. The message was an absolute masterclass in passive-aggressive guilt-tripping. It read, "Your father is still deeply hurt by your selfish outburst, but it is Thanksgiving. Families belong together. If you are willing to come back, serve the holiday dinner, and properly apologize to Samantha, we might consider letting you sleep in the basement." A month ago, that text message would have sent me into a desperate, frantic spiral of anxiety. I would have rushed back, hot tears streaming down my face, desperately begging for their highly conditional forgiveness. But as I read those toxic words now, sitting in the warm, fully heated cabin of my van with a healthy, well-fed Buster resting peacefully beside me, I felt absolutely nothing. No anger, no sorrow. Only a cold, highly calculated curiosity. Why were they suddenly extending this conditional olive branch? Nicholas deeply despised me. Samantha considered me a complete, total embarrassment. They would never invite me back unless my physical presence somehow served a very specific strategic purpose for their public image. I knew I had to accept the fake invitation. I desperately needed to get back inside that house to uncover the absolute truth about the Monterey property document. I needed to look directly into the whites of their eyes when they thought they had me completely under their arrogant control. I typed back a simple, deeply submissive response. I am so sorry. I will be there to serve. I spent the next 2 days mentally preparing myself to step back into the suffocating, heavy role of the broken, heavily indebted daughter. When I finally walked up the long, perfectly manicured driveway of their grand estate on Thanksgiving afternoon, I made sure I flawlessly looked the part. I wore my oldest, most worn-out gray sweater. I kept my shoulders deliberately slumped and my eyes respectfully lowered to the floor. I left Buster safely at a premium dog boarding facility, paying for the absolute best suite they had in cash, ensuring my only vulnerability was entirely out of their toxic reach. As I slowly pushed open the heavy front door, the familiar scent of expensive perfume and roasting turkey hit me. Everly greeted me with a cold, dismissive glare, immediately shoving a heavy silver serving tray into my hands. "Do not speak to the guests unless spoken to," she hissed quietly. I nodded silently, instantly retreating to the kitchen. They truly thought I was completely broken and hopelessly defeated. They had absolutely no idea who had just walked through their front door. I was a Trojan horse. The extravagant Thanksgiving party was in full obnoxious swing by the time the evening sky truly darkened. I quietly navigated the crowded, brightly lit living room, balancing a heavy silver tray of expensive miniature appetizers. The large house was absolutely packed with their carefully selected, highly superficial audience. Wealthy neighbors, shallow business associates, and distant relatives who only cared about keeping up appearances. I kept my face entirely neutral, expertly dodging Samantha as she dramatically paraded around the room in a designer silk gown that my ruined credit had almost certainly financed. As I silently cleared empty crystal champagne glasses from an ornate side table, I noticed a very specific quiet couple sitting stiffly on the plush velvet sofa. They were definitely not relatives, and they definitely were not the usual loud, superficial socialites my parents typically associated with. They were a sharply dressed, serious, middle-aged couple who looked entirely out of place amidst the loud, drunken holiday cheer. They were not engaged in the casual, meaningless small talk. Instead, their sharp eyes were constantly scanning the intricate crown, molding the expensive hardwood floors, and the overall structural integrity of the massive estate. The man was quietly tapping a sleek silver pen against a thick leather-bound folder resting firmly on his knee. They were carefully evaluating the architecture. They were professionally inspecting the property. I stood completely frozen in the shadowy corner of the grand hallway, a cold, sharp realization washing violently over me. They were not here to eat roasted turkey or celebrate the family holidays. They were serious cash-ready buyers. But this specific house in the city was deeply legally mortgaged to the absolute limit. Nicholas had loudly complained about the crippling home equity loans for years. Why would serious, wealthy buyers be inspecting a heavily leveraged primary residence? Unless they were not buying this specific house at all. Unless this specific house at all. My mind immediately raced back to the forged tax document I had discovered hidden in the dusty garage, the multi-million-dollar coastal estate in Monterey, the mysterious property that inexplicably had my forged signature illegally attached to it. The jagged pieces of the complex puzzle began to violently click together with a sickening, terrifying precision. My parents had not invited me back to casually humiliate me or to force me to serve cheap appetizers. They needed me physically present in the house, completely subdued and entirely under their legal control, just in case their lucrative, highly illegal real estate transaction required a sudden, convincing family facade. They were actively trying to sell a massive asset that legally had my name on it, and they were using the noisy, chaotic distraction of a Thanksgiving party as the perfect cover to finalize the shady deal. I kept my breathing perfectly steady. I casually slipped out the back kitchen door, the crisp, freezing autumn air instantly biting at my exposed, flushed cheeks. I moved silently across the dark outdoor patio, pressing my back tightly against the cold brick wall directly beneath the slightly cracked window of my father's private, soundproofed study. I knew Nicholas well enough to accurately predict his sneaky movements. Whenever he was secretly closing a shady financial deal, he always retreated to his study to escape the prying, curious eyes of the main party. Sure enough, the heavy wooden door of the study clicked shut firmly inside. I held my breath, listening intently through the narrow gap in the glass window. I could clearly hear Nicholas's smooth, heavily practiced salesman voice. "I assure you, both the paperwork is completely and legally in order," he stated confidently, his tone dripping with false, arrogant reassurance. "Once the final signatures are verified tonight, the entire Monterey estate will belong exclusively to you. $2.5 million is an absolute steal, but as I mentioned earlier, my eldest daughter Samantha is looking for a rapid, extremely quiet liquidation to fund her new lifestyle brand." The middle-aged man spoke next, his voice highly cautious and strictly professional. "We are fully prepared to transfer the funds immediately, Nicholas. But the original property title still shows a secondary trust linkage. We need absolute, undeniable confirmation that the younger daughter Verisa has entirely relinquished all potential financial claims. The power of attorney document you provided is slightly unusual. Verisa is completely out of the picture." Everly's sharp, venomous voice chimed in, causing a sudden cold spike of adrenaline directly in my chest. "She is deeply unstable and entirely dependent on our charity. The power of attorney is perfectly entirely legal. She signed it willingly before she had one of her unfortunate, tragic mental episodes. You have absolutely nothing to worry about. The property is Samantha's to sell." I stood in the freezing darkness, my mind operating with lethal, absolute clarity. They had blatantly forged a power of attorney to illegally bypass my legal rights. They were actively selling the Monterey estate and pocketing the $2.5 million directly into Samantha's offshore account. They had deliberately orchestrated my complete financial ruin and homelessness, specifically to ensure I was too broken and terrified to ever challenge this exact frauduleux transaction. I slowly stepped away from the cold brick window. I was not going to storm angrily into that study. I was going to let them walk blindly right into their own meticulously constructed trap. Just as I reached for the handle of the patio door, a sharp, highly authoritative sound cut entirely through the noisy chatter of the house. It was the unmistakable, heavy ringing of the front doorbell. If you've ever had a toxic family member try to spin the narrative when caught in a lie, hit that like button to let me know I'm not alone. The game was finally ending. I stepped away from the freezing patio window, my heart beating with a steady, calculated rhythm. I did not need to scream or break anything. I simply needed to let the sheer weight of the absolute truth crush the fragile glass house they had built. I walked back through the kitchen, entering the main dining room just as the heavy front doors swung open. The confused catering staff stepped aside nervously, standing in the grand foyer radiating quiet, immense power. It was my grandfather Charles. He wore a sharply tailored dark European overcoat, looking exactly like the formidable, intelligent man from the hidden photograph I kept in my van. Standing right beside him was Jade, her face a perfect mask of absolute professional indifference. Nicholas rushed frantically into the foyer, his carefully practiced host smile freezing completely on his pale face. Charles did not offer a warm embrace. He did not even greet his son. He looked right past Nicholas, his sharp eyes scanning the opulent room until they landed directly on the wealthy middle-aged couple sitting on the velvet sofa. The entire house fell into a terrifying, heavy silence. The clinking of expensive silverware completely stopped. Charles finally spoke. His voice was not loud, but it carried an undeniable, heavy authority that commanded the entire estate. Why is an elderly couple sitting in the $2.5 million coastal estate I explicitly purchased for my granddaughter? He asked, his tone slicing through the warm, festive air like a newly sharpened blade. Samantha dropped her crystal wine glass. It shattered violently against the marble floor, the dark red liquid pooling like blood. I stepped out of the shadows of the hallway, walking slowly and deliberately into the bright light of the chandelier. I looked directly into my grandfather's eyes. I did not cry. I kept my posture completely straight. "I am homeless right now," I answered him, my voice perfectly clear and completely steady. "I have been sleeping in a freezing van and counting spare change. I have absolutely nothing." Nicholas turned a terrifying shade of ghostly white. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. The wealthy couple on the sofa immediately stood up, their faces twisting with sudden, deep confusion and rapidly growing alarm. They looked from Nicholas to Charles, realizing instantly that the incredibly lucrative real estate deal they were about to secretly finalize was built on a massive, highly illegal lie. The room stopped breathing. Nicholas desperately tried to salvage his doomed, highly illegal real estate transaction. He took a frantic step toward the wealthy buyers, his hands shaking violently as he gestured wildly toward Samantha. He loudly and aggressively claimed that there was a massive misunderstanding. He insisted that Samantha was the absolute legal owner of the Monterey estate, loudly citing a comprehensive power of attorney document. He spun a rapid, desperate lie to the entire room, claiming I had willingly signed the legal rights away during a severe, tragic mental health crisis and that they were simply managing my assets for my own protection. Jade stepped forward, her sharp heels clicking ominously against the polished marble floor. She placed her heavy leather briefcase squarely on the center of the dining table right next to the roasted turkey and unlatched it with a loud final snap. She did not raise her voice. She spoke with the clinical, terrifying precision of an absolute expert. "The power of attorney you are relying on is completely, entirely worthless," Jade stated, sliding a thick, legally certified document onto the table. "When Mr. Charles purchased the Monterey estate for Verisa, he did not simply hand over a standard deed. He established an irrevocable trust. Do you understand the specific legal mechanics of that structure, Nicholas?" Nicholas stared at the thick document, his jaw clenching so hard I thought his teeth might shatter. Jade continued, her tone mercilessly educational. "An irrevocable trust forms an impenetrable legal vault. It explicitly dictates that absolutely no property transfer, sale, or major financial alteration can occur without Verisa signing the documents in person directly in front of a specifically designated federal notary chosen by my law firm. A generic power of attorney, especially one with a highly questionable, heavily forged signature, cannot unlock an irrevocable trust. You have been actively attempting to sell a $2.5 million property that you do not and will never legally control." The wealthy buyers immediately grabbed their coats. The man shot Nicholas a look of pure, unadulterated disgust. "We are leaving," the buyer announced coldly, "and you will be hearing from our legal counsel regarding this blatant attempted fraud." As the front door closed behind them, the absolute reality of their massive failure finally settled heavily over my parents. They had spent months carefully forging documents only to be entirely stopped by a simple, elegant legal mechanism they were too arrogant to anticipate. The forged paper died. The buyers were gone, but I knew the deep systemic financial fraud committed within these walls went much further than a single forged property deed. The guests were murmuring slowly, backing away toward the edges of the room, realizing they were currently standing directly in the middle of a massive crime scene. I walked calmly over to the massive, incredibly expensive smart television mounted on the living room wall. I reached into my pocket, pulled out the encrypted USB drive I had meticulously loaded in the dark garage, and plugged it directly into the side port. I picked up the remote and mirrored the display. I did not yell. I simply opened the first organized folder. The massive 90-inch screen illuminated the dim room with endless rows of highly detailed banking spreadsheets. I slowly scrolled through the records, clearly explaining the data to the horrified audience. I pointed out the exact dates when massive cash advances were violently pulled from my credit lines, immediately followed by matching deposits directly into Samantha's personal checking accounts. I showed them the receipts for her luxury ski trips, explicitly funded by my newly opened, now defaulted credit cards. If you have ever had to quietly collect hard evidence while your own family actively convinced the world you were entirely crazy, hit subscribe before we see how this ends. Then I opened the second folder. This was the final lethal blow to Nicholas's carefully guarded professional reputation. The screen flashed with dozens of highly aggressive anonymous emails. They were the exact messages sent to the top architectural firms violently accusing me of severe mental instability and creative theft. Next to the emails, I displayed the deeply technical network logs. I had tracked the exact IP addresses and the highly specific digital timestamps. Every single one of these career-destroying messages I stated, my voice echoing coldly in the silent room, was sent directly from the primary IP address of this exact house. Specifically from a laptop registered directly to Nicholas. The remaining guests gasped in genuine absolute horror. The quiet, polite society they pretended to belong to was entirely shattered. Nicholas's closest business associates stared at him with wide, completely repulsed eyes. They were currently looking at a man who had actively, systematically assassinated his own daughter's professional career just to keep her deeply trapped in his financial web. The digital ghosts awoke. Nicholas realized instantly that the undeniable, completely objective digital evidence displayed on the massive television was absolutely impossible to refute. The banking logs and the server IP addresses were cold, hard facts. He could not outsmart the data. So, like a truly cornered predator, he desperately pivoted to his absolute favorite weapon, aggressive emotional manipulation. He puffed out his chest, his face turning a violent, highly theatrical shade of red as he desperately tried to reclaim the narrative for the remaining shocked guests. He pointed a trembling, furious finger directly at Charles, who was standing quietly near the dining table. "You have absolutely no right to walk into my home and judge me," Nicholas shouted, his booming voice cracking with highly practiced, pathetic agony. "Where were you 30 years ago? You abandoned me. You left me here to completely starve while you ran off to Europe to build your massive empire." Nicholas paced frantically across the expensive rug, waving his arms to draw the pity of the crowd. He spun a loud, tragic tale of immense suffering. He loudly claimed that he had to make incredibly difficult, ruthlessly pragmatic choices just to keep a decent roof over his young family's head. He tried to paint a picture of a desperately struggling father who was severely traumatized by childhood abandonment, arguing that his harsh, controlling methods were simply necessary survival tactics in a deeply cruel world. He looked around the room, making direct eye contact with his wealthy friends, silently begging them to understand his deeply flawed logic. "Everything I did to protect this family from the exact poverty he left me in," Nicholas screamed, gesturing wildly toward Charles. He was utilizing the ultimate toxic defense mechanism, aggressively blaming his current horrific crimes on a distant, decades-old trauma. He wanted the room to believe that stealing my future was somehow a noble, tragic necessity. He played his final card. Charles did not interrupt the pathetic, screaming performance. He stood with perfect, terrifying stillness, waiting completely patiently until Nicholas entirely ran out of breath and stood panting in the center of the room. Charles looked at his son, his sharp eyes completely devoid of anger, holding only a mixture of profound, heavy pity and absolute, undeniable disgust. He nodded slightly, a barely noticeable movement directly to Jade. Jade calmly reached into her heavy leather briefcase one more time. She pulled out a carefully preserved, heavily yellowed document tightly encased in a protective clear plastic sleeve. She walked forward and laid it gently, almost reverently, on the glass coffee table right in front of Nicholas. Charles finally spoke. His voice was cold, incredibly deep, and sliced through the remaining tension like a razor. "You did not starve because I abandoned you," Charles stated, the absolute authority in his tone, silencing the room completely. 30 years ago, I practically begged you to come to Europe to help me build the business. But your illegal, highly shady local scams were bringing in fast cash. You called me a pathetic old fool. You refused to invite me to your wedding, and you entirely blocked my number because you were terrified I would ask you for a loan. Nicholas stared down at the yellowed document, his entire body suddenly trembling uncontrollably. 25 years ago, your pathetic scams collapsed, Charles continued ruthlessly. You went entirely bankrupt, and you quietly packed Verisa's tiny clothes into a garbage bag. You were going to drive her to a state orphanage that exact afternoon because you aggressively claimed a toddler was a massive financial burden blocking your comeback. Charles pointed a heavy finger at the plastic sleeve. If I had not overnighted that exact certified check for $1 million, with a note calling it a late wedding gift, you would have thrown your own daughter onto the street. You only kept her, and you only fed her because she came attached to my massive paycheck. The ultimate lie died. The devastating revelation about the $1 million check hung in the quiet air like a heavy executioner's blade. Nicholas was entirely speechless, his face a horrifying mask of exposed cowardice. Seeing her husband completely cornered, Everly desperately launched herself forward. She did not attempt to deny the theft. Instead, she resorted to the most deeply twisted psychological defense mechanism imaginable. She violently grabbed the edge of the glass table, her eyes wide and overflowing with highly practiced theatrical tears. You do not understand anything about surviving as a modern family, Everly screamed directly at Charles, her voice shrill and echoing off the expensive vaulted ceilings. We did what we absolutely had to do. Verisa is naturally strong. She is highly intelligent and capable of enduring hardship. But Samantha is incredibly fragile. Samantha needs a beautiful, flawless environment to truly thrive in her career. If we did not provide her with the absolute best luxury lifestyle, she would completely fall apart. I stood perfectly still, watching my own mother passionately justify decades of severe financial and emotional abuse. This is the ultimate terrifying trap of normalized cruelty within a toxic household. They genuinely did not view me as a human being with my own distinct dreams, basic needs, or fundamental rights. To them, my entire existence was simply a practical, harvestable resource. They had completely normalized the horrific idea that it was perfectly acceptable to completely drain the lifeblood of one child, to artificially inflate the shallow, meaningless ego of another. It was a necessary family sacrifice, Everly wailed, looking frantically around the room, desperately hoping the wealthy guests would nod in sympathetic agreement. We were protecting our family's public honor. Verisa owed us that much for keeping her. Samantha, however, did not appreciate being called fragile. The golden child, realizing the entire opulent ship was rapidly sinking, instantly turned on her own creators. "Do not drag me into your pathetic, illegal mess," Samantha shrieked, pointing a furious, trembling finger at Everly. "You are the ones who forged her signature. You are the ones who stole her identity. I knew absolutely nothing about the fake deeds." The pristine, united front of the perfect family was violently tearing itself to bloody shreds right in front of my eyes. They were viciously turning on each other, desperately trying to throw one another directly under the approaching bus to save themselves. I did not flinch. I did not shed a single tear. I simply watched them with the cold, detached fascination of an architect observing a structurally unsound building finally collapse under its own rotten weight. If you believe toxic behavior should never be excused as family survival, hit subscribe before we see how this ends. Then the loud sirens began. The sharp, piercing wail of police sirens rapidly approached the grand estate, slicing violently through the chaotic screaming in the dining room. Red and blue emergency lights began flashing intensely against the tall, expensive living room windows. Jade, the impeccably dressed attorney, calmly checked her silver wristwatch. "Right on schedule," she murmured quietly, her tone indicating that this entire dramatic evening had been a meticulously choreographed, highly controlled legal operation from the very beginning. The heavy front doors were firmly pushed open by 3 uniformed police officers. They stepped into the massive foyer, their hands resting cautiously on their duty belts, their eyes immediately scanning the highly distressed wealthy crowd. Jade stepped forward confidently, presenting her official legal credentials and calmly pointing directly toward the glowing television screen that still displayed the undeniable network logs and banking spreadsheets. The sudden, undeniable presence of law enforcement triggered an absolute blinding panic in Samantha. The golden child, who had never faced a single genuine consequence in her entire pampered life, completely lost her mind. She lunged desperately across the glass coffee table, wildly grabbing at the forged property documents and the certified financial records Jade had laid out. "I did not sign anything," Samantha screamed hysterically, her perfectly manicured hands frantically tearing the copies into jagged, useless shreds. "It was entirely their idea. They made me take the money." The lead police officer immediately stepped forward, firmly grabbing Samantha's flailing wrists. "Ma'am, you need to step back and calm down immediately," he ordered, his voice carrying the heavy, non-negotiable weight of the law. "Get your hands off my designer dress," she shrieked, actively fighting against the officer's strong grip. It was the absolute worst possible reaction she could have chosen. Her frantic attempt to violently destroy the physical evidence, combined with her loud, completely unprompted verbal confession that she took the stolen funds, was essentially handing the officers a beautifully wrapped, fully undeniable conviction. The officer swiftly spun Samantha around, efficiently clicking a heavy pair of silver handcuffs onto her wrists. The sharp, metallic ratcheting sound echoed incredibly loudly in the silent room. The glamorous, untouchable lifestyle influencer was now aggressively restrained, her expensive silk gown twisted and wrinkled. Everly collapsed onto the sofa, sobbing uncontrollably as she watched her precious golden child being formally read her Miranda rights right in the middle of their ruined Thanksgiving party. The illusion was entirely shattered. As the police officers began physically guiding a violently sobbing Samantha toward the front door, Nicholas suddenly snapped out of his paralyzed state. He realized his entire fraudulent empire was completely disintegrating, and his freedom was actively slipping through his fingers. He desperately played his absolute final, most despicable card. He rushed aggressively toward the lead officer, completely blocking the main exit. "Wait, you cannot listen to a single word she says," Nicholas bellowed, pointing a frantic, trembling finger directly at me. He desperately plunged his hand into the inner pocket of his tailored suit jacket and pulled out a thick, heavily stamped medical file. "My daughter Verisa is severely, deeply mentally ill. She suffers from aggressive paranoid delusions. She completely fabricated all of these digital documents because she is currently having a severe psychological episode." The entire room held its collective breath. The police officers paused, glancing uncertainly at the official-looking medical folder Nicholas was aggressively waving in the air. This is the absolute darkest, most terrifying weapon in an abuser's arsenal. When they can no longer control your actions, they desperately attempt to control how the rest of the world perceives your basic sanity. Nicholas aggressively shoved the folder toward the officer. "I have a signed official evaluation from a private psychiatrist right here," he stated, his voice dripping with completely fake paternal concern. "I am formally requesting an immediate emergency medical conservatorship over her estate and her physical person. She is a profound danger to herself and others. She lacks the basic legal capacity to press charges or manage that property." It was a brilliant, terrifyingly evil counterattack. If the police believed his fabricated medical claims, my entire mountain of meticulously gathered evidence could be immediately dismissed as the frantic ravings of an unstable mind. The irrevocable trust might protect the house, but a conservatorship would legally place my entire life, my physical freedom, and my bank accounts directly back into his violent, greedy hands. The silence in the room was completely deafening. Everly looked up, a sudden, desperate spark of dark hope returning to her tear-stained face. They truly believed they had successfully trapped me in the ultimate inescapable corner. I did not panic. I did not scream in furious denial. I did not cry angry tears or desperately beg the police officers to believe my story. Reacting with high emotional intensity was exactly what Nicholas desperately needed me to do, to publicly prove his fabricated diagnosis of my mental instability. Instead, I stood completely straight, my face a mask of absolute freezing calm. I slowly unzipped my worn backpack, reaching past Buster's dog treats, and carefully pulled out a thick, beautifully embossed document, secured in a heavy leather portfolio. "That is a very fascinating claim, Nicholas," I said smoothly, deliberately using his first name to establish an absolute, unbridgeable emotional distance. I walked forward with measured, even steps and handed my portfolio directly to the lead police officer. However, it is highly contradictory to this document. The officer opened the leather portfolio. Inside was a pristine, officially sealed Class A Federal Medical Competency Certificate. "Just last month," I explained, my voice echoing with quiet, undeniable authority, "I officially submitted a highly competitive bid to design a massive new federal public library system. Working on secure government contracts strictly requires a comprehensive, deeply rigorous psychological and cognitive evaluation conducted by a designated board of federal medical examiners. That certificate is fully notarized active and absolutely proves that I possess exceptional mental clarity and full legal capacity." I turned my cold gaze back to Nicholas, whose face had suddenly transformed into a picture of absolute, unadulterated horror. "A purchased, unverified note from a shady private doctor completely vanishes when placed next to a federally mandated psychological clearance," I stated simply. "Your emergency conservatorship is entirely legally impossible." The police officer closely examined the deep federal watermarks on my certificate, then looked at the flimsy, questionable folder Nicholas was holding. The officer's expression hardened into pure professional disgust. He aggressively snatched the fake folder out of Nicholas's trembling hands. Attempting to file a fraudulent medical claim to illegally seize a citizen's assets and obstruct an active fraud investigation is a severe federal offense, sir, the officer growled. The last pillar collapsed. The physical collapse of my father was immediate and absolute. Nicholas's knees simply buckled beneath him. He crashed heavily onto the expensive imported Persian rug, his perfectly tailored suit wrinkling around his defeated frame. He stared blankly at the floor, his mouth opening and closing silently like a suffocating fish. He had spent decades meticulously constructing an elaborate, glittering empire built entirely on aggressive manipulation, psychological terror, and stolen funds. And in less than an hour, it had been completely obliterated by a few pieces of certified paper. The remaining wealthy guests did not offer a single word of comfort. They quickly gathered their expensive coats and practically sprinted toward the front door, desperate to entirely distance themselves from the radioactive disgrace unfolding in the dining room. Everly was curled into a tight ball on the velvet sofa, sobbing loudly into her hands, completely ignored by the officers who were busy actively securing the crime scene. Jade directed the investigative team toward the hidden study, officially pointing out the specific laptop Nicholas had used to send the vicious, career-destroying emails. The police efficiently bagged the computer, the forged property deeds, and several boxes of hidden financial records as critical, undeniable evidence of their massive fraud ring. As the officers formally read Nicholas and Everly their rights, I did not stay to watch them being led away in heavy silver handcuffs. I had already witnessed enough of their pathetic, desperate theatrics for one lifetime. I quietly picked up my worn backpack, nodded respectfully to my grandfather Charles and the brilliant attorney Jade, and walked straight out the front door into the freezing dark night. The bitter winter wind hit my face, but for the very first time in my life, it did not feel oppressive. It felt incredibly clean. I walked down the long, silent driveway toward my battered van, where Buster was safely waiting at the boarding facility. They had absolutely nothing left. Their money was frozen, their public reputations were completely destroyed, and their freedom was gone. I started the van. The following weeks were a whirlwind of rapid, decisive legal victories. Nicholas and Everly were formally evicted from the grand house they could no longer illegally finance. They were forced to move into a tiny, rundown apartment on the absolute outskirts of the city, utterly shunned by their former high society friends. Samantha began serving her lengthy sentence in a federal facility. I did not attend any of their sentencing hearings. I was far too busy building a beautiful, entirely new reality on the warm California coast. I officially moved into the stunning $2.5 million Monterey estate that my grandfather had legally protected for me. The very first thing I did was take a heavy sledgehammer and violently smash down the dark, oppressive dividing walls in the main living area. I replaced them with massive floor-to-ceiling glass windows that perfectly framed the endless, sparkling blue ocean. The house was constantly flooded with warm, golden, healing sunlight. Buster, whose severe joint pain had remarkably improved with consistent premium care, spent his entire days sleeping peacefully on a thick, heated orthopedic pad right in the middle of the bright sunroom. He never had to cower in fear from an angry foot ever again. I transformed the massive overgrown acres behind the main estate into a fully funded, state-of-the-art rescue sanctuary, specifically designed for senior golden retrievers who had survived abusive environments. Professionally, I completely dropped the fake online pseudonym. I proudly launched an independent architectural firm under my real legal name, Veresa. My business exploded with high-profile, lucrative contracts. But I did not keep all the success to myself. I established a robust, heavily funded legal foundation dedicated specifically to providing elite attorneys for young adults who were actively suffering from complex financial abuse by their own toxic family members. And on a quiet Tuesday morning, I anonymously mailed a beautiful, extremely generous gift basket filled with premium artisan goods to a small suburban address. It was for Tess, my distant cousin. She was the only person in that entire extended family who had ever quietly slipped me a warm meal when I was freezing in the dark garage. I built a sanctuary. A year later, the dark, suffocating memories of that freezing van and that toxic Thanksgiving dinner felt like they belonged to an entirely different lifetime. It was a warm, breezy Sunday afternoon in Monterey. I was sitting comfortably on the expansive wooden deck overlooking the crashing ocean waves. My grandfather Charles was sitting right beside me in a comfortable wicker chair, quietly sipping a cup of expensive imported Earl Grey tea. We watched fondly as Buster slowly but happily chased a brightly colored tennis ball across the manicured green lawn, surrounded by 3 other rescued senior dogs who had finally found their permanent safe forever home. Charles looked at me, his sharp eyes softening with a deep, genuine sense of quiet pride. We did not need to constantly discuss the past. The profound silence between us was built on absolute mutual respect and undeniable truth. I had finally learned the most difficult, most liberating lesson of my entire existence. The deep, jagged wounds inflicted by the people who share your exact genetic code are undeniably the most painful scars to carry. But those deep scars do not ever have to dictate the architecture of your future. Family is absolutely not defined by the random accident of shared blood. Family is strictly defined by the people who never ever treat your basic existence as a heavy financial debt that must be desperately repaid. The greatest, most satisfying revenge you can ever achieve against toxic abusers is not watching them suffer in the dark. The ultimate revenge is stepping out into the bright light, building a completely beautiful, successful life, and never, ever looking back at the miserable shadows they inhabit. If you have ever had to build your own family from absolute scratch because the one you were born into completely failed, you leave a heart in the comments and share this story with someone who desperately needs to hear it. Thank you for listening. The door clicked shut,